I would like to show you how to use hue, value, and saturation, the three properties of color, as a guide to mix accurate color. So you see a color in the world, or you see a color in your photo reference or whatever you're painting from, and you want to be able to mix your colors of paint to match that color exactly. Of course, you can bumble your way through it and develop kind of an intuition of what works and what doesn't, and kind of try to get as close as you can. I've just personally found that it's nice to have some kind of process or some kind of way to understand how to go about that, and that's what I'm going to give you in this demonstration. Before I get started on that, I want to bring out this, which is a color wheel. And I think I linked to a color wheel at Dablon for this week under the materials, so you can find it there, or just type in color wheel at Amazon and one of these will come up. There's a bunch of different varieties. I like this particular one for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of just really good practical information about color in these color wheels. You can see that there's a value scale from value 10, white, all the way through value 1, black. And what's nice about that is you can actually scoot this value scale around to the different colors. So you can study where these colors sit on that value scale. So let's, for example, look at yellow right here. And compared to value 1, which is black, there's a lot of contrast there, so it's obvious that yellow is not value 1, but as I scoot this grayscale over, and then have to scoot it a lot over to get to this other side, you can see that the contrast between this gray and that yellow swatch, the contrast gets less and less until I overshoot, and now this value 10, which is white, is obviously lighter than yellow, right? So going backward, looks like value 8, this is darker than the yellow. So my value is probably at around 9, or maybe even between 9 and 10. So somewhere in between those two. And then if I go over to violet, you can see I'm going to start at all the way over at 9 and 10, which was where yellow was at. And obviously violet is a lot darker. So as I scoot over to these darker values and move that value scale across the violet swatch, now I can start to see that violet probably sits somewhere in between 1 and 2. All right, so every color on the color wheel and every variation on these colors in the world has an associated value on that scale from white to black. And understanding that and being able to perceive that is very, very important in terms of your understanding of visual language and how to communicate effectively, because value contrast is one of the most important kinds of contrast. Okay, so we've got hue, value scale, and then saturation on the back. We're given the color plus white, plus gray, and plus black. So these are called shades, tones, and tints. Shade is the color plus black, tone is the color plus gray, tint is color plus white, and all those definitions are here. We've got complements, tetrads, triads, split complements, and all the definitions of what those color schemes mean. So a lot of just really good information about color theory on these color wheels. I definitely recommend picking them up. Okay, so how do we use hue, value, and saturation, the three properties of color? How do we use those three colors to actually mix accurate colors? Let's do this. Okay, so this is a good exercise that I would recommend that you go through as a way of practicing color mixing. So this is a magazine. I got a bunch of these art auction magazines from a student, and so I can just go through and find some challenging colors that I might want to try mixing. And let's do this. Okay, so first I'm going to pull this one out because there's a lot of good examples here. So I'd recommend finding a magazine that you can tear up and use. Okay, so let's see if this works. So the first color that I'm going to attempt to color match here is this one right I'm going to circle it in this ballpoint pen. That spot right here. All right. I've got my color palette out here. Typically a full palette that I use, there are limited palettes that are full palettes. A full color palette that I recommend and I personally use when I'm painting is comprised of a warm and a cool of each of my primary colors. So in this case, my warm yellow is Cad Yellow Deep. I typically don't use Cad Yellow Deep. I usually use Cad Yellow Medium for my warm yellow, but I didn't have any in my box. And then for my cool yellow, Cad Yellow Light. For my warm red, Cadmium Red, Cad Red. For my cool red, I use Alizarin Crimson. For my warm blue, I use Ultramarine Blue. For my cool blue, I use Cerulean Blue. And then I typically have these earth colors, these neutrals, the Burnt Umber, Burnt Sienna, and Yellow Ochre. Those are nice mixing colors. They help to just very subtly shift colors without kind of dramatically affecting things. And then I have white. You'll notice that I don't have black out here. I typically don't use black in kind of a standard like a portrait painting. Instead of using black, I use a mixture of the Burnt Umber and Ultramarine Blue. Together they get to be basically black and play better with mixing with other colors. And it also gives me the ability to shift warm or cool in my black instead of just kind of having one neutral black tone. And I've got a brush that's in pretty bad shape and some water here off to the side. My colors are squeezed out onto a wet paper towel to keep them wet. You'll notice that they're already kind of starting to wick out or seep out into the wet paper towel. If these paints were too liquid, then putting them on a wet paper towel might not be as good idea. But for heavy body, this is a great way to go. So how do I use hue, value, saturation? How do you use the three properties of color to accurately mix these colors to match this color? Step one, you start with hue. So I need to find where on my color wheel would this match up to, right? I've got the 12 pure colors of the color wheel. What family does this color belong to? Right? I know for sure it doesn't belong over here on the reds, oranges, and yellows, right? Definitely not over there. So as I move this around, kind of eyeballing it, where does it belong? And to my eye, it looks like this color belongs kind of in the blue-green, probably, pretty much blue-green, right? So that's the family it belongs in. So what that tells me, if I first determine its hue, that tells me which color I need to reach for first. That tells me where I need to start, all right? Obviously, those are two very different colors, so I'm not done yet. Just tells me a good starting point. So what I'm going to do is look over here on my palette, and my blue-green, I don't really have a blue-green over here, but my cool blue, cool meaning closer to yellow in this case, is cerulean blue. So I'm just going to put a little bit of cerulean blue down there as to create a color trail. And this is something I recommend you do too if you do this exercise. I might try mixing a little bit of yellow in there to see if that gets me a little bit closer in terms of hue to the blue-green. And actually it does. I think that's a little bit of a better fit than the cerulean blue by itself. So I've got this kind of, it's fairly green, right? It's kind of blue-green. So that's where I'm going to start. Hue. So I've matched, I'm in the ballpark with hue. Value and saturation tend to be adjusted together because if I add white to this mixture to make it lighter, I'm also affecting the saturation of the color. I'm making it less saturated because white is a neutral and it's taking it away from pure color. So value and saturation come next. This color this green that I've got, or blue-green that I've got, I'm going to put a little bit inside the circle there. You can see is quite a bit darker than the color that I'm trying to match. So white makes sense in this case, right? So white is going to actually make it lighter value-wise, but it's also going to make it less saturated, which is a good thing because this blue that I'm trying to match is also less saturated. So if I mix the white in with that mixture, I come back and put a little bit on there, you see that I'm quite a bit closer. Let's see if I can hold it up to the thing. I'm quite a bit closer in terms of value, and actually when that dries, I will probably be pretty spot on. So with acrylic, you need to kind of overshoot in terms of value because it tends to dry darker than it is when it's wet. So value-wise, that's probably pretty good. But you'll notice that while I've got the value closer to the mark, it still isn't quite right. It's still too bright. The blue's too bright. It's too saturated, right? So I need to somehow make it less saturated without messing up the value. Okay, so what can I do? There are two options that I have. I could mix a gray, a shade of gray that's the right value, that's pure unsaturation, pure neutral, right? So I can mix a shade of gray that's exactly the right value that I'm after to make it less saturated without messing the value up. Another thing that I can do, or that I actually just want to make you aware of, is you can actually mix in a little bit of the complement of that color. Mixing complements together makes them more neutral, pushes them more towards gray. So in this case, I'm going to take a little bit of this burnt umber, which isn't direct complement, but it's pretty close. These are blue-greens, and the complement, or brown, is in the red-orange side of things. So it's actually pretty close to a complement, and this is one of the reasons I have these neutral, warm color, earth colors out there, is because they're really good for situations like this when you need to knock down the transparency just subtly. All right, so I added a little bit of that burnt umber in there, and I'm actually really close to matching that color. I made it a little bit darker because of the burnt umber, so I might want to go back and pick up some white to bring the value back a little bit lighter, and it's also going to make it a little less saturated, so I might have to bring in a little bit of the original color to match it again. But there, I've got a pretty good match. So this color would be color that I might, call what? That would be some kind of mustard, maybe, or if there was a kind of a, your interior designer named colors. There's all sorts of different names we could come up with it, and that's why I'm recommending that when you're thinking about color, that you just get all of those unusual names out of your head. Just think in terms of the 12 colors of the color wheel. Where does this belong related to those 12 specific colors? In this case, that is definitely not on the green side of the color wheel. As I move this around, it is kind of, it most closely approximates orange. And then toward the fringes of that little spot right there, maybe it gets into kind of yellow-orange. So orange, yellow, orange. Go over to my my palette over here. So this Cad Yellow Deep is probably closest what I'm looking for in terms of saturated color, but I've actually got some other options out here already that are less saturated. I've got Yellow Ochre and Burnt Sienna and Burnt Umber that also belong to these families of color on the color wheel. So maybe one of those would be a better fit. I'm looking at this, the Yellow Ochre specifically, and let's see what that looks like when I put it out here. And the Yellow Ochre is perhaps a little too desaturated, a little too neutral, but it's also pretty close. So maybe that's going to help me out. Let's see, put a little bit out there. Not bad. And it's also a little too yellow. Maybe it needs to be warmed up a little bit. What if I add a little bit of this Burnt Sienna, which is a little warmer than the Yellow Ochre, a little bit more, has a little bit more of the orangey in it. And that's actually probably the closest I've got yet. So I'm going to ditch the cad yellow deep because it looks like I'm going to be closer in terms of saturation by using one of these earth tones. Okay, so I'm going to use a mixture of the burnt sienna and the yellow ochre. And I'm already pretty close, except for I'm a little bit too dark and a little bit too saturated. So white is probably going to be the best option to make it lighter in value and more neutral or desaturated. And let's see where that gets me. Too far. So I've got a bunch of the color over here and there. I'm pretty close. Maybe bringing a little bit of the burnt sienna back in there. Not bad at all. All right. So here we've got that cad yellow deep that didn't quite match up. Let me see if I can hold that up here. But then you notice that over here, you don't see that kind of saturation contrast, and it seems to match a little bit better. Okay, I'm going to do one more color swatch here. This is from a painting. It looks like these are sunshades of some kind. They kind of have a alizarin, like a crimson, purpley kind of tint to them. But it's kind of hard to identify exactly what that color is. And that is the problem we have when we're trying to mix accurate color, is it's kind of not sure what that color exactly is, right? And there's no possible way to give a specific name to every single color we see. So I start with hue. Where on the color wheel would that awning relate most closely to? And it would probably be with this red-violet. I'm kind of generalizing that all those colors together, even though I see kind of violet and red-violet and blue and a couple different things there. But kind of red-violet is the overall color that I see. So what do I have on my palette here? As the Alizarin Crimson is probably my closest thing to that. I put that out there. And obviously that Alizarin Crimson is way too dark and too saturated. So if I add white, it's going to lighten the value and desaturate. And as I paint over that original swatch, and I should be giving myself a little history of that, but you'll notice that now I've got basically the right value. It might still be a little bit too dark. I've got basically the right value, but it's too saturated. So how do I desaturate red-violet? I can use one of my earth tones, which are less saturated, warm colors, less saturated orange, red orange, and yellow orange in the case of yellow ochre. And that's most likely what I would do. But I could also use the complement of purple, of violet, and that is yellow. So let's see what that does. In this case, I would probably use yellow ochre, but let's see what happens when I put a little bit of my cad yellow light in there. Complements desaturate each other. I'm going to put a little bit of the white back in there to get it back up to the right value. And that gets a little bit closer, but it's still too saturated. So I'm actually going to try to add some of burnt umber. Burnt umber is a great mixing color because it's a nice dark value for the darker colors, but it's also a very neutral brown. So it's good for kind of sucking out all the saturation of a color, which in this case is what I want. So that got rid of some of the saturation. It also made it too dark. Let's go back here. And that's getting better, but I'm noticing now that the color is a little bit too reddish. Kind of need it to go a little bit cooler, a little bit more blue. So I'm going to add a little bit of my blue in there. Whoa, too much. See what that did. And that's actually pretty close right there. Now, it is a little bit too light in terms of value, but when it dries, it's going to be a bit darker. And that actually, the paint's not going to stick to this shiny paper very well, but you can see that is a pretty good approximation of the rest of that, of the awning there. Right? So if you get to the end and it still doesn't look like the right hue, you can also go back and make adjustments to the hue after the fact. And, you know, I, in this case, wanted to make it a little bit cooler and a little bit closer to blue instead of violet or red-violet. So that's a good exercise to go through when you're trying to learn how to mix accurate color. And a good way to give yourself kind of a mental framework to approach mixing accurate color. Start first with identifying the hue family that your color belongs to. Find the right color of paint on your palette. If you don't have the right color of paint on your palette, no matter what you try, you're not going to be able to mix the right color. And this is actually something that comes up more often than you would think in art classes, is that students will try to be mixing a color and they just don't have the right color out on their palette. So, you know, make sure that you've got, if you're trying to mix a full range of color, then you've got to have a full palette or pretty close to a full palette. Then you're gonna adjust value and saturation by either adding a neutral, black, white, or gray, or you can also adjust saturation by adding a complement or a color that's close to a complement of the color you're mixing. Complements together, when they mix, go neutral, and so that's a way that you can adjust saturation in addition to adding a neutral.